Welcome back. We're getting into obsession, pressure, and the weird cost of winning. And then that whole question of what happens when success starts eating your life. The crazy part is he does not sound confused about it at all. He sounds like someone who made peace with the treadmill and hated that he did. The treadmill is undefeated, apparently. What hit me first was how early the whole thing started. Sick kid, out of place, then YouTube becomes oxygen. That is not a normal origin story, that is a pressure cooker. And then people act shocked when the person is a little extreme. Bro, the man basically grew up allergic to wasting time. What I find interesting is the family pressure gave the obsession a moral purpose. Yeah, it was not just fame, it was survival and wanting to help his mom. That changes the whole vibe from ego to duty. But duty can still turn you into a machine if you never stop. Which is basically what he admitted, just in a more polished way. Polished in the sense of, I have not slept like a human in years. The part about criticism is where it gets dark fast. 5,000 comments telling you to kill yourself is insane. And that's probably only the tiny fraction he remembers. That's the thing. Most people do not realize what scale does to your brain. If 1% is unhappy and your audience is massive, that 1% becomes a city. A city of strangers yelling at you with perfect confidence. That's honestly the internet in one sentence. His answer was basically, I need internal rules or I will get cooked. That felt like the strongest thing he said all episode. Because if the internet is your moral compass, you are finished. Exactly, then you do not stand for anything, you just react. And reacting for a living sounds exhausting and stupid. That's most of the modern creator economy, to be fair. What did you make of him saying the more good he does, the more people suspect him? That is such a cursed internet behavior. People cannot process large-scale goodness without looking for a hidden invoice. If you buy a mansion, you are honest. If you build wells, you are secretly a villain. Bro, what a society. I think he is right that helping people became part of his identity, not a PR costume. Yeah, and he sounded almost annoyed that people keep making it deeper than it is. Sometimes a guy just likes making things and helping people. The issue is people do not trust joy anymore, they assume strategy. Which is wild because maybe the strategy is just that he likes it. That is actually a more dangerous answer for critics. Because then they cannot even tell him to stop for the right reasons. The travel schedule part was brutal, though. Deadliest places, hospital, Florida, North Carolina, then another flight. That is not a week, that is a controlled demolition of your body. He was bragging about being on podcasts at 1 in the morning like that is normal. Normal people are sleeping. Jimmy is in a different time zone spiritually. The real cost there is not just tiredness, it is identity fragmentation. He keeps talking about gear shifting like it is the enemy. That actually made a lot of sense to me. If your brain loves obsession, random context switching is torture. Trying to switch from main channel to chocolate to a show all day sounds miserable. Bro needs a whole human operating manual just for calendar management. And then he gets honest about mental health, which was refreshing. He basically said his success depends on being able to suffer on command. That is such a brutal sentence. It is brutal, but it is also probably true for a lot of extreme performers. Most people want ambition without the pain bill. Yeah, they want the trophy and a soft pillow. When he says he might hit 1 billion subscribers, part of me thinks he believes it. He does. And that confidence is kind of the whole engine. Delusion is sometimes just long-term consistency with good lighting. That is outrageously accurate. The fiancé conversation was a nice grounding moment. It was the first time the schedule sounded survivable. Because she is not competing with the work, she is designed around it. Which sounds romantic until you realize that is a very specific lifestyle test. That relationship interview was basically, can you survive my calendar? But the alignment matters, especially when work is the center of gravity. I also liked how he talked about wanting kids, but not yet. Because he knows the current life would make him an absent dad. That level of self-awareness is rare, honestly. Most people would just have kids and panic later. And then call it character growth. The business side was maybe the most underrated part of the whole thing. People see a YouTuber, but he is talking like an operator with a giant balance sheet. 9 figures in Feastables changes the conversation completely. That is no longer a side hustle, that is a second empire. And he is still acting like he is behind schedule. The ethical sourcing part is where the whole thing got real for me. Yeah, because that is not some trendy marketing angle, that is ugly supply chain reality. 46% child labor on cocoa farms in West Africa is horrifying. And the fact that the industry just shrugs is even worse. He sounded genuinely offended by the economics of it. Like, if the farmers are making almost nothing, the system is already broken. Exactly. And then the cheap chocolate is basically subsidized by children. Which is a sick sentence, but that is the math. He really said, I want $1 billion a year and less child labor. And that is the part I respect. Profitability is not separate from the mission. If the model works, then excuses get way weaker, which is exactly why the established companies hate it. Because now the question is not can it be done, it is why did you not do it already? That question is brutal at boardroom parties. The Tesla comparison actually fits here more than people think. Prove the better version is possible, then the rest of the market loses cover. Exactly, and that is how he seems to think about a lot of his businesses. It is less look at me and more watch this standard change. Which is why he is impossible to box in as just a creator. He is a creator but also a founder, operator, and full-time chaos engine. The chaos engine is doing numbers, though. That is the wild part, the madness is attached to results. And beneath all that, he keeps circling back to one thing. He just wants to decide his own line and keep moving. That felt like the real thesis of the episode. If the internet hates it, he will still do it anyway. Which is either the healthiest or craziest survival strategy ever. Probably both, which is annoying and impressive. All right, that is the energy for this one. We will pick this up next episode with where the ambition collides with bigger stakes. Episode 3 is where it gets even messier. Welcome back. This one is about obsession, pressure, and the price tag on success. He keeps saying the internet can hate him, but it still gets under the skin. And the wild part is, the higher he goes, the louder that gets. Bro, 1% of his audience is apparently still millions of angry people. Normal people call that a bad day, not a personal apocalypse. But for him, that 1% becomes the whole emotional weather report. That is the first thing I could not stop thinking about. Because if 99% love it, why does the 1% still win mentally? Because the human brain is a terrible accountant when it feels attacked. That is so true. It ignores the giant pile of good news and stares at one comment. And for him, those comments are not random noise, they are daily artillery. He literally said thousands of people have told him to kill himself. That is not feedback, that is digital poisoning. Exactly, and then we act surprised when creators stop sleeping and start spiraling. He kept coming back to this idea that the brain was never built for that volume of abuse. Which is such a clean line because it makes success sound less glamorous and more violent. 1 billion views and a nervous system in shambles, the modern dream. Bro, that is actually hilarious and depressing at the same time. What I liked is he did not pretend it stopped affecting him. He just got better at deciding what deserved access to his head. That sounds healthy until you realize it also means living with permanent armor. Yeah, and armor helps you survive, but it also makes you heavier. That tension was everywhere in what he said about work, too. He almost talks about work like other people talk about religion. Honestly, yes, like if you question the mission, he gets personally offended. Which is fair, because the mission is basically his entire personality. But that is also what makes him so rare. He does not have a hobbyist relationship with ambition. He treats it like a full-body condition. And the cost is that nothing else gets to be casual. The travel schedule alone sounded brutal. South Africa, Florida, North Carolina, then straight into more flights. At that point, your home is basically a rumor. And he was saying the gym has basically fallen apart because of it. Which is wild because even his personal health turns into another negotiation. That was the real theme for me. Everything is competing for the same hours. And if he is filming, building businesses, and running a giant show, something has to bend. The answer was apparently the gym, which is tragic but extremely on brand. He basically said sleep got wrecked first, then the workouts got wrecked second. That is the part people miss because they only see the output. They do not see the fatigue stacking up in the background. And then he said something even more revealing. He is happiest when he is building. That chocolate company clearly matters to him in a different way. Because it is not just money for him. It is proof that business can be moral. The ethical sourcing part was the real pivot in the conversation. 46% child labor on cocoa farms in West Africa is insane. It changes the whole frame, because now chocolate is not just a product. It is a supply chain problem with a marketing disguise on top. Big Chocolate basically said, "That is just how it is," which is horrifying. That line should make everybody uncomfortable. He was not speaking like a brand founder trying to look noble either. He sounded genuinely irritated that the system exists at all, which is why it feels believable when he says he would rather do this than just sell chocolate. But that also raises the classic question, is he driven by values or by scale addiction? Come on, it is both, and that is exactly why it works. He is obsessed with solving a real problem, but he is also addicted to winning. And maybe those two things are the same engine in his case. I think that is what made his answer about money feel honest. Money is fuel, not the finish line, which is easy to say when you are already a billionaire on paper. That is a devastatingly fair point. But even then, he keeps his personal spending weirdly restrained. He said he pays himself basically what he spends each month. That is such a strange flex and such a practical habit at the same time. It is actually consistent with everything else he said about reinvesting. He seems to treat cash like oxygen for the machine, not like a trophy. And that ties into the part about never wanting to be 70 with regrets. He is clearly trying to make the future feel less haunted, which is noble but also exhausting to live inside. The relationship stuff surprised me too, honestly. He described his fiancée like the final boss of low-friction compatibility. Same games, same shows, same appetite for his chaos, apparently. But that actually matters more than people think. If your life is that compressed, friction at home becomes a huge tax. So the relationship is not a side note. It is part of the survival system. And then there is the kids question, which he clearly has not rushed. He wants them, but not while he is basically living on planes. That was one of the most responsible things he said. Because a lot of people romanticize parenthood without thinking about presence. You cannot mentor kids properly if you are gone 200 days a year. Unless the kid also has a private jet and a film crew. The craziest thing is how self-aware he is about all of it. He knows the pace is destructive, but he also knows it is the price of the output. So the real question is whether the machine ever gives him room to breathe. I do not think it does, not really. It just gives him different kinds of pressure. And maybe that is why this episode felt less like success and more like endurance. Yeah, it is not a victory lap, it is a stress test. Which is exactly why it is so good. Because underneath all the jokes, the whole thing is about what ambition costs. And whether a person can stay human while paying it. That is the scary part, because he is making it look barely possible. All right, let us leave it there before we spiral too hard. This was episode 2, and we will be back for the messier turn next. Episode 3 is where the ambition starts hitting the wall harder. Welcome back, because this episode gets into the ugly price tag of obsession. He is basically saying success is a stamina test, not a mood. And the wild part is he does not romanticize it at all. He is like, this is brutal and I still chose it. That is what makes it interesting, though, because most people want the trophy without the wreckage. Right, they want billionaire energy with a normal sleep schedule. He is not selling that package deal. What hit me first was how much of his identity is built around refusing the internet's opinion. That is such a dangerous place and such a necessary one. Because if the crowd gets to define your morality, you are done. Exactly, and he is basically saying he had to build his own spine. Which sounds dramatic until you realize the internet will absolutely bully you for existing. He is getting thousands of messages telling him to die, over and over. Nobody is designed for that kind of constant poison. And then people act shocked when someone becomes weirdly armored. Yes, Karen, the comments section was not a healthy childhood substitute. That is so true, though, because he is describing algorithmic stress like it is weather. One bad video and suddenly he is thinking everyone hates him. That is what scale does. It turns tiny percentages into emotional earthquakes. 1% sounds small until it is millions of people yelling at you. Most creators are fighting for a few thousand comments, and he is drowning in a city. And the weirdest part is he cannot even tell what is real criticism anymore. Right, because when the noise is that loud, genuine feedback gets buried. So he ends up living by internal rules instead of public approval. That is actually the only way to survive that level of attention. But it also means you have to be okay being misunderstood all the time. which honestly he seems annoyingly okay with. Annoyingly is the right word because he just keeps moving like a tank. And then there is the family side, which makes it even heavier. He was not just chasing views, he was trying to save his mom. That changes the emotional math completely. Now, every bad upload is not just a bad upload, it is panic. That is the kind of pressure that makes crying feel rational. He talks about hiring friends, hiring his mom, reinvesting everything. So failure was never abstract for him, it was payroll. That is a very aggressive way to learn responsibility. Bro, imagine being 20 and your upload decides the household mood. That would wire your brain forever. Which is why I do not buy the casual version of this story at all. This was not just hustle, it was survival wearing a hoodie. But I do think there is a line where survival becomes identity. And then you do not know how to stop even when you could. That is where the mental health cost gets scary. He admits the constant travel, the flu, the sleeplessness, the chaos. And still he frames it like this is just the game. The game is clearly trying to kill him, though. Minor detail, yes. What do you make of his obsession with momentum? I think he is addicted to output because stillness feels like decay. That is a real fear for some builders. But it is also a trap because not every pause is death. True, but for him, pause probably feels like losing the whole machine. And maybe that is why he keeps stacking bigger and bigger projects. Because if he is not stretching the thing, he is just sitting there with his thoughts. Which sounds peaceful until you realize his thoughts are basically a full-time job. Exactly, and he even says he has to manage how he frames reality. That is the part I found most revealing, honestly. Not the money, not the fame, the mental self-management. Because at that scale, your mind becomes infrastructure. Which is such a terrible sentence and somehow accurate. It really is, though, because if the infrastructure breaks, everything breaks. And that leads into the chocolate piece, which is where his obsession becomes moral. Yes, because now it is not just about winning, it is about fixing something. He finds out nearly half the labor on some cocoa farms is child labor. That number is insane. It is the kind of statistic that should have destroyed the whole industry years ago. Instead, people shrugged because cheap chocolate is convenient. That part made me mad too because the excuses are so lazy. And his response is not subtle at all. He just wants to prove it can be done ethically. That is actually a very Elon-style move, whether people like him or not. Build the thing first, then make everyone else's excuses look stupid. Which is basically his entire personality, just on a higher decibel setting. But I respect it because he is not hiding behind branding language. He is saying, I do not want to get rich off child labor. That should not be a radical sentence, but somehow it is. And he is already thinking in systems like a symbol, a standard, a model. That is where the scale becomes interesting, because he can pressure the whole market. If he proves a profitable, ethical version, the entire industry gets embarrassed. Which is one of the best business strategies ever invented. It is so funny that his version of flexing is paying farmers more. But that is exactly why it matters, because the flex has a conscience. And then he gets to the part where he says he would not sell the company for $5 billion. That is the line that tells you everything. Because if the mission is real, the exit option is not the point. Most people hear that and think he is bluffing. I do not think he is. I think he genuinely sees selling as betrayal. Right, because then somebody else gets to dilute the mission. And he would rather stay in the grinder than watch that happen. Which is insane, but also kind of beautiful. That is the central tension of the whole conversation for me. Is this just obsession, or is this what conviction actually looks like? Maybe both. And that is why it is so exhausting to watch. All right, we have gone deep enough to need a breath. Episode 3 is where that conviction starts getting tested even harder. And that is where the whole thing starts to wobble in a fun way. Fun for us, terrible for him, obviously. Welcome back. This one is about the price of obsession and the weird math of success. He basically says the internet can love 99% of you and still bury you alive. That is such a brutal sentence because it is also true. And the wild part is he is not even using that as a pity story. He is basically saying, I decided my own rules, good luck internet. Which sounds arrogant until you realize the internet is actually insane. Bro, when even helping people gets you called evil, you are in a cursed arena. That part really hit me, because the more good he does, the more suspicious people get. That is such a bizarre social reflex, like kindness needs to have a hidden receipt. People see a charity move and immediately start building a villain origin story. And yet he just keeps going, because his standard is internal, not public. That is the real backbone thing, honestly, not the money or the views. But you can hear how expensive that mindset is mentally. He is getting hit by criticism all day, every day for over a decade. And people telling you to kill yourself thousands of times is just not normal. Human brains were never meant to process that scale of hostility, especially when you are 20 and your whole family is depending on you. That is where the crying makes sense, because the stakes were real. It is hard to feel carefree when your mom is on the payroll. That's such a cold way to put it, but yes, exactly. He is not just chasing views, he is carrying a whole machine on his back. And now the machine has gotten so big that even sleep becomes a strategic issue. That schedule sounded absolutely brutal, by the way. Africa, hospital, Florida, North Carolina, podcast at 1 in the morning, then Steph Curry. That is not a life. That is a migrating bird with production meetings. A billionaire hummingbird, basically. And he is honest that the cost is his body, his gym time, and sometimes his mood. Which is why the mental health part feels less like a confession and more like a trade-off. He is saying, no one else wants this life, and I think he means it. Most people would indeed prefer not to film on hard mode forever. Shocking revelation. Humans enjoy weekends. But he also frames suffering as the edge, which is a very dangerous bargain. Because if pain becomes proof, you can start romanticizing burnout. Still, he does seem aware of that line and tries to manage it. The gear-switching thing was fascinating, because it sounds like chaos kills him more than work itself. He wants obsession, but he wants it in clean buckets. Which is funny, because his life otherwise sounds like 20 tabs open, and one of them is on fire. Then you get to the relationship piece, and suddenly the whole thing softens. The fiancée sounds like the rare person who can actually fit into that storm. Not by shrinking herself, but by understanding the rhythm. That matters because otherwise success just becomes loneliness with better lighting. Better lighting and more flights, unfortunately. And then the chocolate business is the part where the ambition turns into ideology. That is where he stops being just a creator and becomes a company builder. The ethical sourcing piece is not branding to him, it is the point. Hearing that a huge chunk of cocoa labor can be child labor is horrifying. And his reaction is basically, if this industry works on that, I want out. Which is a nicer response than most companies, who apparently just go, cool anyway. He is mad enough to build a whole alternative system, which is the most him thing ever. That is also why selling feels impossible for him, even at $5 billion. Because then the mission becomes somebody else's spreadsheet. And he clearly would rather keep the burden than lose the control. All right, that feels like a good place to breathe. The next one gets even more intense because the mission starts testing the man harder.